The 13th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act. Not only did these enactments mark pivotal moments in the history of the United States, they are also landmarks on the road to making America a better nation and a fairer democracy, one that more closely reflects the ideals of its Constitution. There is now a bill before the Senate that may come to be seen in a similar light by future generations. America is at a crossroads. Its democracy is at its most vulnerable point since the Civil Rights Movement and possibly since the Civil War. It can reemerge stronger than ever on the foundation of a rebuilt and reinforced democracy, or it can descend further into a dysfunctional, hyper-partisan tyranny of the minority, in which politicians care more about serving themselves and their party instead of their country. The bill that promises to set America on this brighter path is HR1, or S1 as it has already passed the House of Representatives. In this episode, I will outline what this bill will actually do, address some of the concerns about it, and explain why this will be the most important bill of the Biden administration. Why is HR1 so important? At the beginning of this series, we said a democracy must represent the will of the people, serve all people, and actually serve. Since its inception, problems such as voter suppression, gerrymandering, and big money have undermined each of these pillars. HR1 addresses all of these problems and thus strengthens American democracy. If you wish to learn more about these problems, I suggest watching the videos in this series that address them. Much of what HR1 does is universalize across the United States best practices that already exist in many states. In order to combat voter suppression, HR1 mandates automatic voter registration, same-day registration, early voting, mail-in ballots, as well as making Election Day a holiday and re-enfranchising former felons. For gerrymandering, HR1 makes partisan gerrymandering illegal and requires that redistricting be performed by independent redistricting commissions. To address big money in politics, HR1 strengthens super PAC disclosure requirements, makes super PAC coordination more difficult, reforms the Federal Elections Commission, and subsidizes small donations 6-1. Now, HR1 doesn't fully address all the issues mentioned in the series, such as polarization, but does go a long way in confronting these long-standing problems. The bill also has provisions that address other smaller but still important issues, such as restricting the influence of foreign actors during elections, requiring presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns, and making it more difficult for politicians to become lobbyists and vice versa. It should be clear by now that HR1 makes it easier for everyone, both Democrats and Republicans, to vote, and makes the system fairer. And it looks like it has come not a moment too soon. According to the Brennan Center, 253 bills that make voting more restrictive have been tabled in state legislatures so far this year. This compares with 35 bills for all of 2020. The vast majority of these restrictions are being tabled by Republicans. It should be mentioned that many of these bills probably won't get anywhere. At the same time, there are 704 bills being tabled that make voting easier, most of them advanced by Democrats. Nonetheless, there are some details that are a bit alarming if you are concerned about fair access to elections. Over a fifth of these bills are being tabled in 4 battleground states with legislatures controlled by Republicans, so there's a good chance many of them will pass. Most of these bills are being advanced on the basis of making elections more secure, though one has to question that motive when witnessing bills like one being advanced in Georgia that would make giving water to people waiting in line to cast a ballot illegal. Are these actions of politicians genuinely concerned about election security, or is it simply an attempt for them to strengthen their grip on power by preventing the other side from voting? I think the answer is obvious. If you're familiar with physics, you know that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Just as there are many politicians supporting HR1, there are many speaking vocally against it. Is there any validity to their arguments against HR1, or are they just attempts to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt? Let's have a look. The arguments against HR1 that I've seen can be grouped into 3 categories. This is constitutional federal overreach, this is a waste of hard-earned taxpayer money, and this undermines election security. Regarding constitutional federal overreach, the Constitution states that even though states conduct elections, the federal government is allowed to impose regulations on how they are conducted. There is some debate about whether the super PAC disclosure rules in HR1 infringe upon the First Amendment, but it is clear that, in principle, what HR1 aims to do is constitutional. With regards to federal overreach, it's common among countries for a federal government to establish a minimum standard that subnational governments have to follow as a way of ensuring all of a nation's citizens enjoy the same rights and privileges. As we mentioned earlier, HR1 is mostly about universalizing the best practices that currently exist. The waste of taxpayer money complaints are mainly based on the fact that HR1 will match donations of less than $200 6-to-1 as a way of counterbalancing the influence of big money. However, the funds for this program come not from general taxation revenue, but from increased fines on those convicted of corporate wrongdoing. The other claimed wasteful use of government funds is related to a pilot program included in HR1, where 3 states will give voters $25 vouchers they can choose to donate to their favorite candidate. This is an experiment, not an egregious waste of taxpayer funds, and again, this will be funded from corporate wrongdoing fines, not general revenue. Last but certainly not least, much of the opposition to HR1 purports that it will undermine election security. As we discussed in the voter suppression video, voter fraud is extremely rare, and there was no evidence of meaningful voter fraud in the 2020 election. If you're skeptical, go check out that video. In many ways, HR1 actually makes voting more secure by requiring paper ballot records and by universalizing automatic voter registration, which reduces registration errors. One point of contention for HR1 opponents is a provision in the bill that allows people to vote if they present a signed, sworn statement. The reason this option was provided was to counter overly strict voter ID laws. It should be noted that other countries, for example Canada, have a similar option in their systems, and the penalty for fraudulently voting this way is perjury, which has a penalty of up to 5 years in prison. I know it may be hard for many of us who are connected and engaged with society to imagine who wouldn't have a basic form of identification. However, there are people who are old or poor or live in remote areas who do not have an ID, and they should have the right to vote as much as anyone else. So how can HR1 become a reality? HR1 has already passed the House. The big challenge lies in the Senate. The good news is that the Democrats, the party that wants to pass democratic reform, with the vice president's tie-breaking vote, now have a majority. The bad news is that if things remain as they are, there is absolutely no chance of HR1 passing. This is because of the filibuster, something we talked about in the first episode of this series. As it stands, the filibuster gives a minority of 40 senators the ability to veto any legislation. In the current partisan climate, with a Republican Party that cares more about maintaining its own power than strengthening American democracy, it is nigh impossible that HR1 will get the 60 votes necessary to overcome a filibuster. There are only 2 ways HR1 can pass. The first is if the filibuster is abolished. However, with 2 Democratic senators dead set against this appears unlikely. There is a chance, however, with the second option. The filibuster may only need to be reformed in order to allow HR1 to pass. In the past, one had to speak constantly in order to sustain a filibuster. After the senators were done speaking, a normal vote could take place on the bill, a vote that would only require a simple majority. There also seems to be support for filibuster reform, with President Biden and more importantly Joe Manchin, one of the Democratic senators opposing abolishing the filibuster, appearing to back the idea of making the filibuster painful. However, Manchin appears to be against other filibuster reforms, such as requiring 41 votes to sustain a filibuster instead of 60 votes to overcome one. Though it appears there is a pathway for HR1 to pass, I believe it needs the support of everyone who supports democratic reform to cross the finish line. Contact your senator. Tell them to support these desperately needed democratic reforms, and tell them you support abolishing or reforming the filibuster if that's what's required. I'm going to end this series by sharing my own bias. I'm not American, nor do I live in the United States. Some of you are not going to like what I have to say next. With the rise in autocracy and ebb of freedom around the world, we need a strong America more than ever. Is America a perfect country? Absolutely not, and it never has been. But it stands for values that we can all get behind, such as freedom and equal opportunity, unlike other powers that only care about dominance and the power of an elite few. As the famous Republican Ronald Reagan once said, freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than 1 generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance, it must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. With what's happened in the last 4 years and the Capitol riots, this feels like one of those generational moments where freedom must be defended. Do your part and make sure HR1 passes.